In order for our online and streamed audience to hear questions, we're going to ask the questioners use the microphone, which is located close to this lectern, so that your questions will be well heard by our significantly larger and broader audience than those of us who are in here in this room. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to our speakers. Who's first? Come on up.
How's this? Can you hear? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amilcar Barreto, and I am the chair of the Department of Cultures, Societies, and Global Studies in Social Sciences and Humanities. And for this academic year, I'm also the interim director of the International Affairs Program. So I'd like to start with a few comments, but I'm far more interested in opening this up to lively conversation. So I'd like to start by saying that pundits in particular love to talk about peoples of Latin American origin as if they were one monolithic group. The reality is that we have different national origins. Our motivations for immigrating to the US differ, or migrating in the case of Puerto Ricans. Our racial identities vary, not only between groups, but also within groups and by generation within the US. All of these experiences shape how we deal with American society, how we identify with American society, and how we interact with the American polity. So I'd like to bring up 4 themes. Perhaps in the Q&A, we could open up the discussion with one of these or some other, but I thought this would be a good place to start. The first is colonialism and race. Second, Latino cartography. The third, the great Cuban exception. And fourth, partisanship, the culture wars, and honorary whiteness. So the first is colonialism and race. Now, I don't want to sound historically deterministic, but past colonial experiences do shape how we interpret our experiences in the US. And they were significantly different in Latin America than they were in Anglo-North America. So from the start, for Spanish and Portuguese colonial experiments in Latin America, racial mixing started from virtually day one. Now let's be clear, with very few exceptions, what we're talking about overwhelmingly are European men, Spanish and Portuguese men, and indigenous, later African women. I doubt if any of these relationships, to be candid, were consensual. But be that as it may, it generated from the beginning a very large mestizo and mulatto community, depending on which country in Latin America, to the point that racially mixed peoples are the majority in virtually every Latin American countries. We can talk about 1 or 2 exceptions. So Latin America developed a very different racial schema than in North America, whereas here it was the one-drop rule. And if you had any quantum of African ancestry, you were tossed out of the white category. In Latin America, instead, what developed was much more of a continuum. Some people call that colorism. Now, here's a very uncomfortable conversation, and mostly for my people. Many Latin Americans would like you to believe that our racial mixture eliminated racism in Southern America. They'd claim that Jim Crow in the US and apartheid in South Africa represent the gold standard racism. This was the centerpiece of the so-called racial democracy thesis, an idea that was popularized in the 1930s by Brazilian writer Gilberto Freire. On my home island of Puerto Rico, the form this takes is the so-called Gran Familia Puertorriqueña, the great Puerto Rican family, same basic concept. Folks, this is a myth. Racism is alive and well in Latin America, unfortunately. Yes, you can have racism in racially mixed societies. It just operates differently, not better, it's just different. It's less direct and more passive aggressive and micro aggressive. And it's also more fluid. Again, that's not necessarily a good thing, but there is built-in fluidity. Wealth and status can quote unquote whiten someone. Let me give you an example. I'm talking about a friend of mine who's a professor at another university. She would identify herself quite proudly as African-American, born and raised in Brooklyn. Now, she was in Brazil and she shared with me one of the experiences of traveling to Brazil, and she does speak Portuguese. Where in the beginning, she'd walk into a store and people would look at her phenotypically. She looks Brazilian. She looks like she fits in. Until they would ask her a question and she would respond in Portuguese, but with a clear American accent. Oh, you're not from here. That would precipitate more questions. And, oh, you're a professor? Well, my friend would describe herself using the Portuguese word for black as negra, just like negra in Spanish, same word. She would be corrected. They would tell her, and in Portuguese, você não negra, you're not black. She'd be like, excuse me? And they would respond, oh, no, you're mulata. Actually, you're mulatinja was the word that they like just a little. I mean, right before her eyes, she was being whitened, and that came as a direct consequence of her status as a professor. So again, these boundaries are mobile. That does not mean lack of racism. It's just a different modality. So one of the consequences of all this is that you have folks who in Latin America are seen as white, are treated as white over there. They come here and are seen as brown and treated as brown. So their white privilege in one setting doesn't translate into white privilege in another. Some find this shocking, some shift into denial. But it's much more difficult for their US-born children and grandchildren to see it the same way because they grow up here. They're in tune with the way American society deals with race in ways that are subtle and gross. So how long we've been in the US, immigrant, first generation, second generation, is an intervening variable. We have one way of looking at race in Latin America and a different way in Anglo-North America. The second point, Latino cartography. Here there are three subpoints, which I call the great spread, the pockets, and the Appalachians. So the great spread. Starting in the 1990s, nativists, xenophobes, and other bigots warned Americans that if immigration from the South was not stopped, the Latino horde would consume the Southwest of the United States and seek to have it separate from the US and rejoin Mexico. For those who are not familiar with your American history, the states that are currently the Southwest of the US used to be the northern half of Mexico. Well, what's transpired in the past 4 decades could be nothing further from the truth. What we've witnessed instead is an incredible spreading of Latin American immigration, even very far from the border with Mexico or any part of the Caribbean. There are certainly larger pockets of Latinos along the border, the US-Mexico border. But just to give you a quick example, I had to look this up recently. I mentioned 1990, when the nativists start raising all sorts of fuss about this issue. In 1990, Boston was 11% Latino. As of the last census, it's 20%. Now that pales in comparison to Providence, Rhode Island in 1990, just under 5%. The latest census, 43%. Folks, we're about as far as you can get from the Mexican border, with the exception of like Hawaii and Alaska. And now this is not coming exclusively from Mexico or even primarily. It is Puerto Rican migration, it's Dominican, it's Salvadoran, it's Colombian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, the thesis that there's going to be one big Latino pocket that is going to emulate Quebec and Canada and seek secession, the reality on the ground is very different. And finally, next, the pockets. So despite the spread, we do have very distinct pockets. The Southwest, dominated numerically by Mexicans. Greater New York, Central Florida, dominated by Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. South Florida, dominated by Cubans. Hence, the role of Latinos in US politics, especially US presidential politics, varies based on which community and in which states. Some states are up for grabs and some are not. And then interestingly, the Appalachians. I mention this because this mountain range demarcates an interesting phenomenon among Latinos. There are two distinct Latino realities in the US. That's the border. From the Appalachians west, Latinidad is going to be dominated overwhelmingly by Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Even as other nationalities from Latin America move into these areas, just numerically, they will be drowned out by a much larger Mexican pool. I know this from personal experience. My parents live in San Antonio, Texas. And if I'm in public, I'll be speaking Spanish with my parents. And if we get stared at in San Antonio, it's not because we're using Spanish, but we're using that weird Caribbean accent from their perspective that they're not accustomed to. Okay. So anything east of the Appalachians, what we're going to get is the great Latino mishmash, a mixture of numerous groups where no one group really truly dominates. In fact, I think with the 2000 census, perhaps I'm off by one census, Puerto Ricans stopped being the majority of Latinos in New York City. The majority now is a mix of various nationalities. Third major point, the Cuban Exception. The great migration of Cubans to South Florida was precipitated by the Communist Revolution. So who left Cuba? Overwhelmingly the upper classes, some of the middle classes. This was a much more conservative, much more bourgeois immigration, very different than every other Latino group, where overwhelmingly it's the working classes who are migrating. Hence, Cuban politics has a very clear conservative bent that is lacking in other Latino nationalities. This is translated, of course, in case of Florida, into greater support for the Republican Party, far more than you would find among Latinos in Texas and California, New York, et cetera. This may change over time, but we will see. And finally, my last major point, partisanship, culture wars, and honorary whiteness. So this happened before most of you were born, but it was in the 1992 Republican National Convention, presidential candidate Pat Buchanan rang the alarm that the US was in the midst of a great culture war. Now, if you're announcing it in 92, that means the war has already been ongoing. Now, it's very hard to pick a moment when a movement begins. But I would like to point to one particular year when we can really document it before and after. The year is 1980. And in particular, two documents that will show you this is really where the culture war is written down are the Republican and Democratic National Conventions, the party platforms. So 1980, the Republican Party vigorously embraces the religious right, overwhelmingly white evangelicals. That is also the same year that the Democrats timidly embrace LGBTQ rights. And they wrote into their platform, quote, all groups must be protected from discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, language, age, sex, or sexual orientation. That had never appeared in a major party platform before. Since then, the two major political parties have continued to bifurcate. There was a time that some of us can recall when in-your-face nativism, racism, misogyny, homophobia were things that were shunned in public. No longer. These matters are openly flaunted in very large political rallies. Bigots were always there. They've just aggressively come out of the closet. What does this mean for Latinos? The suspicion is that for future generations, Latinos will be overwhelmingly aligning themselves in terms of partisan affiliation with the Democratic Party. The exception, and there are always exceptions in every community, will be those Latinos who cling to the second highest status in American society. If the highest status pertains to whites, second highest status belongs to honorary whites. Honorary anything is by definition a status that is not permanent. It can be revoked. It can be taken away. These are folks who hear inflammatory Latinophobic rhetoric and just ignore it, dismiss it. So in closing, when we talk about Latino politics and identity for the foreseeable future, rather than present one image, I think it's more accurate to talk about almost a kaleidoscope. We'll see what happens in a half century or a century. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Gabby. I think you can go to the next slide. Sure. Good evening. My name is Ángel Nieves. I'm professor of Africana Studies, History, Digital Humanities, and English. I'm director of Public Humanities and director of our Public History program in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. For the record, Ted Landsmark, one of your faculty facilitators, had asked me to take part in the Open Classroom's focus on repairing a divided America, race, hate crimes, and reconciliation, an ambitious endeavor putting together facilitated discussions, presentations, and talkbacks. And so I agreed to do this talk today. I will say he wasn't alone in making this course happen, but he's been one of the major influences in making it possible. Ted is one of those people on this campus, I've come to find out, that it's difficult to say no to. And not because he asked in a particularly gracious or convincing manner, which I admit he did. And Ted is probably always one of the most gracious and welcoming people on this campus. And for the record, this is only my second year at Northeastern. No, it's difficult to say no to him because he himself embodies the kind of effort so many of us try to make every day as social justice workers, who have also worked across and through a wide variety of communities: Black, white, Latinx, Asian American, Indigenous, LGBTQIA, and so many others, without a second thought to politics and identity, or the politics of identity that have become such a dividing line in America today. I mentioned Professor Landsmark in particular because he's deserving of much praise, and I'm pretty sure he hasn't shown you this photograph. And I would like to offer him thanks for the work he's done and is still doing to advance civil rights and social justice. His iconic status here in Boston means that he's also especially aware of what it means to have a stage, including the one where I find myself and our colleagues find ourselves, my colleagues find ourselves, to affect change. Interestingly enough, our third speaker this evening is going to focus her comments on Boston. So mine are meant to have you reflect on a couple of points, I think, that have already been spoken to by the previous speaker. Much of the change that both Ted and I and our many colleagues here tonight have been a part of in our personal and professional lives have been not because we compartmentalized ourselves into echo chambers erected by colleagues and peers from our own ethnic or racial backgrounds. Instead, we were part of a series of social justice movements that were multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multi-generational. As students who were activists, we understood that our power to make change happen wasn't only through our voices, and at many of the higher ed institutions we attended, our voices would be amplified by our future power as alumni. But more importantly, our growing numbers made change happen when we reached across the aisle and brought together our common goals to end institutionalized racism, homophobia, rape, and exploitation of nearby marginalized communities that labored to cook, clean, and keep our educational institutions running. In all frankness, there have been a great many more issues, and I anticipate more issues to come. And there have been many a drawn-out battle between university administrators and student activists. And I hope to learn what some of those have been here at Northeastern as I continue to learn its particular history. I want to recall some of my particular history as a student activist for you. I'll come clean here and say that in the mid to late 1990s, as a graduate student at Cornell in the snow-covered hills of Ithaca, interesting that upstate New York was mentioned already, there wasn't too much to do, and so we found ourselves agitating to bring new resources to the Latino Studies program in particular through new faculty hires, a new housing set-aside known as the Latino Living Center, and better mental health services for students by actually hiring staff that had experience serving the Latinx community. These were just some of the demands made by us graduate students, along with undergraduates. What I remember most about that year-long struggle at Cornell wasn't that the College of Arts and Sciences needed to eventually install surveillance cameras in the entry foyer and lobby of the building because of guerrilla installations highlighting the institution's continued acts of violence towards people of color. Rather, it was the meetings we held in the African-American undergraduate theme house we called Ujima, which is the Swahili word for extended family. It was there that graduate students, undergraduate students, staff, faculty, and community members gathered in solidarity on a weekly basis to discuss upcoming strategy while also paying particular attention to the schoolwork needed to be finished that week, without any regard for the racial makeup or ethnic background of the students involved, their age, where they came from, or even what college or school at Cornell they attended. The common unifying factor was that the university was intending to do away with an already under-resourced area of study, a program, Latino Studies, that despite years of neglect was thriving. These programs were making a difference with a great many students majoring and minoring in Latino studies, and in addition, graduate students outside the discipline from across the Cornell community were getting the necessary subject area expertise that dovetailed with any number of programs, including, and not surprisingly, environmental studies, industrial relations, genetic engineering, and so on. So why do away with a subject, a program area that was thriving and making a difference? It was the very same coalition building that helped secure a future through activism that the university administration was most weary of. The administration's fears came true in the response to a multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multi-generational student coalition with support from faculty, staff, and community members was not unexpected. For the record, I'm not a Pollyanna here, far from it. But instead, I'm incredibly grounded in the present moment. By recounting the past, my own political journey, the way politics and identity are intertwined for me as a queer Latinx scholar from New York City is not in a place of nostalgia. I recount this narrative as just a brief reminder that coalition building has always been something that has been well practiced among social justice workers, beginning as far back as the creation of the NAACP, the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, and so many other organizations. We got a real taste once again of what coalition building means through the Black Lives Matter movement, something catalyzed by the death of George Floyd and so many others, and the massive voter turnout of people of color for the 2020 election. 4 years under the Trump administration was a true aberration for so many of us as people of color and our allies, especially as scholars and especially for me as a historian who understands the antecedents for the kinds of behaviors we witnessed and experienced during those years. Specifically, I'm talking about the dismantling of our rather fragile safeguards against single rule autocrats who espouse ethnic and racial hatred. For Trump, politics and identity were so intertwined that he easily targeted members of the Latinx community, both real and imagined, in ways that mirrored how African Americans were portrayed in the Jim and Jane Crow era. They're here in the United States from the 1870s to the 1960s and elsewhere, and quite similarly, the deeply anti-Semitic portrayals of Jews in Germany during the rise of the Nazis, the 1940s. All the signs were there of a rinse and repeat cycle where Trump and his enablers were poised to take us to the brink of another civil war or another war on foreign soil. The groundwork for demonizing the other was laid out by further criminalizing migrants seeking asylum at our southern border and finding ways to punish Latinx mothers for attempting to bring their children across the US-Mexico border who were fleeing gang violence or narco traffickers, all of whom had been perversely empowered by America's war on drugs from decades earlier. This past September, we commemorated the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. A recent Netflix film entitled Worth depicts the struggle of an attorney named Kenneth Feinberg, who was tasked with determining the value of a human life, what a life was worth, and to convince family members to accept his assessment in order to begin making claims against a compensation fund after years of litigation. The film also depicts the struggle to get 11 undocumented families to become a part of that program, as those families found it hard to believe that the others would allow them to make claims against the compensation fund. Many of the 11 families were rightfully concerned that they might instead be deported. That particular story of the many undocumented workers who daily labored in the shops, cafes, and fast food venues in the underground belly of the Twin Towers, the New York City subway, and the other mass transit lines that made the site a major transportation hub out of Manhattan is only briefly mentioned in the 9/11 Memorial Museum. I would even argue that their stories remain largely untold still today. And to be honest, their stories would not be much different from those who make struggle after great struggle to build a life here in the US, much like the stories of those children who were taken from their mothers and families at the US-Mexico border, and who to this day have not yet found their way back to one another. As a historian who's written about formerly enslaved African-American women in the US South, in Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C., I'm always struck by the many moments in American history when the state, our US government, has allowed through legal means or otherwise the breaking up of non-white families in an effort to control and dominate what they perceive to be a possible threat. The threat is not what will happen should these communities regain a foothold in telling a different story about the past, a more complete narrative, or to hold those accountable for past injustices, or even in reparations. Rather, it is in control over the narrative and the loss of control over how, when, and who gets to tell the story. That's what is most threatening to many in power. Most recently, Congress approved legislation to begin work on fundraising and a site selection for the National Museum of the American Latino, with discussions that it should be located across from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I remain hopeful that the stories will be heard of those migrant mothers who lost their children on the border because of the Trump administration's harsh policies at immigration, and will be told alongside those stories of the workers in the underground network of shops and fast food restaurants in the belly of the Twin Towers destroyed at 9/11, and those students who agitated for the strengthening of Latino studies programs, not only at Cornell, but at many colleges and universities across the country, especially in recent years. I mention these because they are just a very small slice of how we might begin to consider politics and identity, or the politics of identity among subgroups within the Latinx name, or why we have the exciting opportunity to gather here tonight to discuss these messy, very messy, but significant topics. Thanks.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Natalia Urtubey, and I have the distinct privilege and honor to serve the city of Boston as the current director of small business in the Office of Economic Development. But I think I was invited today because I am the founder and liaison to the mayor's office for the Latinx Employee Resource Group in Boston. So I'm the only one up here that's not a professor, so you're gonna have to bear with me and my awesome presenting skills. So what you're gonna see here today, I'm gonna talk about the research study that was conducted by the Boston Planning and Development Agency. So I am adapting their presentation. You can actually find the full presentation on bostonplans.org. Highly recommend you look at it because I'll probably mess up a couple of times, but I will get you the gist of that data, which is really, really interesting. So first of all, the historical population of Latinos in Boston. So as you can see here, and as Emil mentioned before, the population has grown drastically since 1970, where it was merely 17,000 people, to 2020, where it's over 126,000 people in Boston. So as you may know, Boston's population is right now around 750,000. So you can see the comparison there of how large that population actually is. The Hispanic population in Massachusetts since 1990, and this cool gift that they created, you can see how fast it's grown and where the pockets of Latinos really are in the city of Boston and outside of Boston throughout Massachusetts. So here, 1 dot equals 50 people, and it starts in 1970, and it goes all the way to 2020. And I will also share these slides so you can look at them later. In Boston, you can see that 1 dot equals 100 people. And one of the interesting things that I think Boston has, which I don't think will be surprising to anyone in this room, is that Boston's minority populations are very segregated across the city. And a lot of that had to do with redlining that you've probably heard and learned a lot about. But it also had to do with, obviously, affordability and where Latinos could actually live, mostly who were living with families and larger households. So in 2020, there were some methodological changes that happened, which I think are really important for the discussion of race and specifically for Latinos, because the Latinx population, as Emil also mentioned, changes depending on who you ask, how you identify as a Hispanic American, as a Latinx American, or Latino, or Latina, or Latine now. So in the 2020 census, did anybody here fill out the census yourselves? I know students oftentimes don't get the census. Okay, so a couple people. So you may have noticed this. Did anybody fill it out in 2010? Okay, a couple people, okay. So this might be totally irrelevant for your experience, but what was really big this year is that in 1940, the word Hispanic first appeared on the national census. And it was a way for the US government to be able to classify anybody who spoke Spanish. They didn't really think about what it meant ethnically, what it meant racially. So in 1940, we see the word Hispanic appear on the census for the first time. In 1980 is when you first see the census ask a second question. Are you ethnically, what is your race? And then are you Hispanic or not Hispanic? So that was in 1980. In 2020, we saw that there was a couple more tweaks. So it was a little bit more specific around where you might be from if you are in fact Latino. So the question number 6 is this person of a Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Really trying to narrow down where the person filling out the census was from. No, not of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. Yes, Mexican, Mexican-American, or Chicano, this is light years ahead of the US government. Yes, Puerto Riqueño or Puerto Rican. Yes, Cuban, or yes, other Hispanic. And then they mentioned some examples of countries of origin where so me as a Colombian immigrant, I would write yes and write Colombian there. The next question is about race, right? So mark X if you are white. And this is where it gets really tricky because even in the examples, as you may see here, you see German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, and Egyptian. So I don't know if you've ever been to Egypt or Lebanon. Most of those people are not necessarily identifying as white. So this is where there's still a lot of complexity around the census. The second option is Black or African-American, African-American, Jamaican, Haitian, Nigerian, Ethiopian, and Somali. As you can see there are 0 countries of Latin American descent in that option. So super complicated. The third is American Indian or Alaskan Native, which includes Navajo Nation, Blackfeet Tribe, et cetera. Mayan, Aztec, native village of Barreto, Inupiat, traditional government, Nomi Eskimo community, et cetera. So as you can see, there's a little bit more description there. And then there are options for Chinese, Filipino, Asian, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, Native Hawaiian, Samoan, Chamorro, other Asian, or other Pacific Islander. And then if none of those apply to you, then you could choose another race. If you, as a Latino who maybe have multiple origins, you have the option to write additional options, right? You can say that you may be of Nigerian and Colombian descent. And then anyone who fills in more than one of these boxes would just be qualified as either some other race or two or more races category. So that has shifted the way that the city of Boston in particular and Massachusetts and across the nation, people are identifying. So in Boston, two or more races increased while white alone sharply decreased. So because you gave people more options of how to identify, we saw those numbers actually become more real. So as you can see here, some other race alone was in 2020 is the orange, was over 59,000 people. Two or more races increased dramatically by more than 30,000 people. White alone decreased dramatically from 42,000 people to 16,000 people. Black or African American alone also decreased, because I anticipate that a lot of those who identified as Black or African American in 2010, if they had Latino or other ethnicities, they would identify as two or more races, et cetera. The largest two or more races categories include some other race. So obviously it is not always traditionally something that you can mark, but you can see here that the largest percentage of these folks who identified as having two races at least were white. So 22,000 people identified as white plus another race, or the second highest was 10,000, and that was Black and some other race. So as Emil also mentioned, the two largest Hispanic populations in most major cities are Dominican and Puerto Rican. Here in Boston is the same. You can see Salvadorian, Colombian, Mexican as the largest populations, and then a couple other countries. Brazilians, and this is, again, I'm gonna just keep pointing back to Emil because the story he told is so relevant in Boston and across the nation. Brazilians are not classified in the census as Latino, even if they identify as Latino. So if a Brazilian person put Brazil and they checked the Latino box, they are not classified in the US Census as Latino. And that is a big, complicated and controversial statement, because Latinos in particular, Brazilians in particular, those who identify as Latino, because they may also have shared identity, shared experiences, identifying in those ways, are not being classified in that way. They are classified as white. So Brazilians in Boston have also grown over the years, but as you can see, there's been dips and changes based on how they identify in the census. So in 2010, they were about 4,200, and then in 2019, 5,700. So some of the characteristics of the Latino population in Boston: we have more Hispanics that are native born in Boston than ever before. So we're seeing the actual homegrown Latino population growing dramatically over the last 40 years. You're also seeing more foreign-born Hispanics becoming US citizens. So pathways to citizenship are really growing and changing, and as you can see here, how they've changed over time. So in 2019, 45% were naturalized citizens and 54% were not citizens, as opposed to the previous year where those numbers were dramatically smaller. Well, larger and smaller, I guess. One of the most interesting characteristics I find constantly is that nearly a third of Boston's children are Hispanic. And in BPS, 40% of students in the Boston public school system are Hispanic or Latinos. And that is huge population shift according to the rest of the population in Boston, and really indicates how important it is for us to have real representation of the needs of those students and those young children across the city. So talk a little bit about the labor force. We have a larger share of Hispanic, foreign-born, and women are not in the labor force. So as you can see here, native-born Hispanic is that dark blue, foreign-born Hispanic is that orange, and where all of Boston is. So those who are working full-time, part-time, unemployed, and not in the labor force, you're seeing a huge percentage of foreign-born and women not in that labor force. So that's really detrimental to the labor force because of the population numbers that they take up. You're also seeing that Hispanic workers are about 18% of resident workers, and they're more likely to work in jobs that must be done in person. So as I'll talk about later around the impacts of COVID-19 and impacts on the Latino population, how dramatically scary that was for those workers. We also see here that 25% of Hispanic business owners work in construction or private households, so a lot of entrepreneurial focus there, 13% and 12% in construction and private households, daycare services, taxi and limousine, so a lot of that, direct service work. Cubans, Salvadorians, Colombians, and Dominicans are more likely to be business owners. So 10% of the Latin-owned businesses in Boston are Cuban, 9% are Salvadorian, 7% are Colombian, 6% are Dominican, et cetera. Full-time Hispanic workers earn lower wages. So as you can see here, native-born again is that blue and orange is that foreign-born Hispanic. And where and how they compare to the rest of the Boston population. So that blue line is, that red line, wow. Red line is really, clear across all of these wages of how deeply impactful it is to Latino workers. Hispanic workers are, Hispanic wages are lower for all workers, employees, and business owners. So the median wage of, median earnings of Hispanic workers, as you can see, Boston is much higher than the rest of the population here. COVID-19. So during COVID-19, all of the existing disparities, equity issues that we have heard so much about, not just obviously in this classroom, but across our national dialogue, these disparities have been exacerbated by COVID-19. And in Boston alone, you can see the impacts of confirmed COVID cases. Now, this can obviously be because they were essential, a lot higher population of workers in the Latino population were direct service workers, essential workers, but it could also be tied to the size of household populations and access to alternative housing options during that time. I remember when we were first tackling the pandemic back in March and April, we were desperately trying to figure out how do we help large immigrant families that had a positive case, and where could we partner to give people an option to be somewhere else, especially if they had to, if they had workers in the household or small children or elderly folks who we're really scared to get exposed. And that was, I think, one of the first indications of these disparities that we were noticing. And this was before we even had numbers and real words to put into perspective. So as you can see here, Latino and Black populations were the heaviest impacted populations by COVID-19. And then I'm going to just briefly talk about my work a little bit. So in small business, obviously, you've heard small businesses were deeply impacted by COVID-19. So many of them had to shut down immediately. And small business owners, they struggle, right? Because at the end of the day, it's just them most of the time. And so we put out really quickly a lot of relief efforts. As you can see here, the total percent of issued grants compared to the total estimated percentage of those businesses. I do want to say that our business data is not that great, so we don't actually know who owns every business. So this is, again, the BPDA research team coming to my rescue oftentimes. But what we tried to do was to make sure that our Black and brown businesses in Boston were getting that first round of relief every single time to ensure that as they were putting their lives on the line to be essential businesses, to be essential workers, that they were also getting that support from us directly. So 11% of all of our funding has gone to Latino businesses, which compares to about 13% of the population. But to date, we've given out $19.6 million to over 4,900 businesses, which is pretty remarkable because it's not easy to give away money as you might think. And then now I'm going to talk a little bit about Latinx employees because, as you may know, the city of Boston, in order to be an employee at the city of Boston, you have to live in the city of Boston. So it's really difficult with housing costs. It's really difficult with the type of work that we do to retain employees. So I was let me talk a little bit about employee demographics first. You can see here that the Hispanic demographics for Boston by ethnic group, 32.8% of our male population. Sorry, I'm going to say this wrong. Make sure I don't get this wrong. So in Boston, of the ethnic group, 38% of Latinos are male and almost 62% are female workers, which is huge. Of the total population, we have about 14.6 Latinos, self-identified Latinos working for the city of Boston. So it is close, not quite as representative of our population, but it is getting closer and closer every year. Additionally, when we talk about being able to sustain employees in the city of Boston, we talk about wages, right? And so making sure that our wages are equitable across the city. Due to unions and things like that, it's oftentimes a lot more equitable than you might see in other spaces, but there's still some work to do here. And then how long they've been working for the city. A huge chunk of our workers have been working for the city for over 5 to 10 years, which is really remarkable when you think about longevity and being able to keep employee retention. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the events that we hosted, but we started the the Latinx ERG, the Employee Resource Group, in 2017. The response to 2018 as a response to Hurricane Maria that devastated Puerto Rico. Mayor Walsh brought a bunch of Latinos around a table and said, hey, how can we help? What can we do? And after that meeting, I looked around this table and I said, why aren't we doing this? Like sitting around this table and having dialogue about how we can help Latinos in Boston. And not only that, but how do we support each other? So I went to the diversity office and I said, hey, can I start an employee resource group? And Mayor Walsh was like, do it. And so here we are a couple of years later. And one of our signature event is the Hispanic Heritage Month kickoff event, where every year at the beginning of Hispanic Heritage Month, which is September 15th through October 15th, we actually light up City Hall in orange to represent and to stand in solidarity with the Latino population here in Boston. Over the last couple of years, we've been able to actually get other buildings to do it in solidarity. Maybe next year we'll get Northeastern, but we've gotten the Greenway, UMass Boston, the Zayton Bridge, Government Center, South Station, and working on, and the Greenway, did I say the Greenway? To also light up. And so as you start seeing more and more orange, it's usually on the 15th and it lasts maybe a couple of days depending on other scheduled events, but it's a really beautiful ceremony. So this year, it was on September 15th, and we did it both virtually and in person. So it was really cool to, I just closed Selena's face. And we were able to have Mayor Jamie come. We had our Chief of Equity, Selena Barrios Milner, who's a Venezolana. She's a Venezuelan immigrant who leads our equity work at the City of Boston. And it was a really beautiful event to continue this wonderful ceremony and amazing ritual that has slowly become a tradition in Boston. Here's just a little thing that we put out there to highlight some of our employees. As you can tell, they are very diverse. We have people from Spain, we have people from Brazil, we have people from Haiti, and every Latin American country that has been mentioned today. It's really important to us that we, create a very inclusive and thoughtful space for Latinos in Boston. I also want to take an opportunity to invite all of you to a salsa dance party tomorrow. It's going to be at City Hall from 5 to 8. We're going to have a DJ, dance lessons. There's a really cool pop-up beer garden that's going on. So if you're free tomorrow, please come by. I'll let some pictures get taken so we don't forget. Good job. You win extra points today. And then I just want to highlight that this is slowly also becoming more of a citywide celebration across, a lot of our media here in Boston. Some other events and things that we do with the Latinx ERG is we have coffee hours. We've done a Tres Reyes, a Three Kings celebration and toy drive. We, during the pandemic had birthday celebrations on Zoom. We do flag raisings and other really fun events to try to recruit and also just spread the word about, what's going on in City Hall. It's actually become a really great way of supporting other employees, both with promotions and recommendations, but also just giving ourselves a safe space to talk and to, air out and have discussions about things like, what do we call ourselves? Do we call ourselves the Hispanic group? Do we call ourselves the Latinx group? Do we now change it to Latine because that is more inclusive of Spanish speakers? So these are, constant dialogue that we're having about race. And then finally, I want to just also let you know that on Sunday, October 31st through Monday, November 1st, city is doing a Dia de los Muertos. This is also a big tradition in Latino culture and specifically Mexican culture. But we've been working on this event for the last 4 years where there's an actual altar set up at Copley Square. And it is a really beautiful celebration of life. So if you are around Copley Square that weekend, also goes into Halloween weekend, I highly recommend you pop by. It's a really beautiful ceremony. And I'm done. That was long, sorry.
So my guess is that before we get into audience questions, you may have some questions or comments for each other.
How many of you had seen? Hello? No? I just feel bad for the Zoom people because they can't hear us, right? How many of you had seen that historic photo of Ted? Everyone had seen it. So that wasn't new. Okay. You'd never seen it before. I knew you hadn't seen it before. That was a surprise today.
For decades,
Actually, that was on the Antiques Roadshow about a week ago. For the picture, not for the subject.
Well, the reason I asked that is because a lot of Bostonians have no idea, like they'll see a picture like that, but they won't associate that with that only being, 40 years ago, and how deeply impactful those moments have been in Boston and continue to have a lasting impression. And I got to work, and actually where we met was when I was working on the Imagine Boston 2030 initiative for the city, which was the first planning process, citywide planning process since 1965. And in that exercise, there was so much talk about race and equity. And this picture came up a lot, not because of Ted, obviously because of Ted, but really because of how so many people remember that, right? And remember how much has not changed from those times. And so as we think about, at least every single day in my work at the city, we're talking about how do you make real lasting and impactful change that through policy, through programming, through building trust with community members so that you don't have those types of events happen again. So you guys are all super lucky to get to be in Ted's class because he's fantastic and amazing, and I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I'm very flattered. Let me ask a question about one of your specific slides there. And it's the second time I've seen this. If I remember the numbers correctly, if one is a Latinx employee in Boston, you're earning about $25,000 a year. But if you are self-employed, you're earning about $20,000 a year, which doesn't seem to begin to address all of the added burden that goes with being a self-employed individual in Boston. What accounts for those numbers? Because they seem to be, they certainly are substantially lower than average income levels, but what really accounts for those numbers?
So again, I'm not a researcher, so I will probably not have all of the data, but I would say that a lot of that counts for the hours worked and what skill set they're using. So for Boston employees, that can be maintenance workers, that could be, working in a community center part-time. We do have a lot of elderly folks who work with us 10 to 15 hours a week in order to, there's actually two programs. One's a volunteer tax credit program and the other is employee program. But I also think a lot of that is there's still a lot of disparities in the way that we hire and pay people. And a lot of it has to do with one, trying to find equality across paying folks. And so if somebody, for example, this happened to a colleague of mine who came from one department. And when she started at that department, she started, she was probably like 18 or 19. And back then, there wasn't as much focus on pay, wage, parity. So as an 18-year-old Latina woman, she started at the lowest you could possibly start. When she left that department 7 years later and came into a different department, the city dictates that you can only go up one step from what you were making in your previous department within the city, right? And so when she came into that department, she was the lowest paid person by a lot compared to the people doing that same job in that department. So now I'm not saying that there's anybody at fault necessarily here, because these are the ways some of these systems have been deeply, ingrained in the HR system in the city of Boston is something that I know Mayor Walsh has been working on. I know Mayor Janey's been working on, but these are like things that are just passing through, and you see, and this could have happened to a white person. So, it's just the way the system is built. And so this woman who has already 7 years of experience under her belt comes into a department and she's getting paid significantly lower than her peers, not because of her skill set, but because of a rule in hiring at the city of Boston. So that's with the city of Boston employees. I would anticipate that wage parity across the city is just terrible for immigrant populations, including Latino populations, because they're oftentimes doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do. And so they are paid less. Those jobs and those skills are valued less, which I think is a dramatic refocusing of pay and wage, in my opinion. It has to be about the value of the job and not necessarily the skills associated. That's just my soapbox. So I hope that helps. I don't have all the data though, but I will get you that so that you can share with the group.
And in relation to that, I'd heard a story that if you were to ask the average bodega owner whether they would want their children to go into the same business of running a neighborhood grocery store, that the almost unequivocal answer would be, no way. I would not want to pass this kind of low-paying self-employment opportunity that one might not get elsewhere to my own children. So that certainly seems to suggest that for those people who are self-employed, who are taking advantage of the presumed opportunities that exist in a place like Boston, which is booming, and in the United States, maybe the return on investment isn't all that great.
Well, it's the American dream, is to open your business when you come to this country. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that owning your own business is going to always be lucrative. And I think as Boston has become more expensive, commercial rents have also become more expensive. People don't want to pay more for goods and services. And as someone who works with bodega owners every day, you know that they are probably the only staff. So not only is it low pay, but they're working 70, 80 hours a week. And so, yeah, I mean, I hear that all the time. A lot of what we're trying to figure out is how do we help those business owners actually sell their businesses upon retirement, to have a retirement to go and actually retire, but also as wealth building opportunities for other businesses. A lot of that has to do with commercial acquisitions and whether or not people can actually own the properties that they are selling or, of their business. And most of them don't own those properties. So that becomes a really challenging step too, because it takes out of their revenue and therefore what they end up paying themselves. During the pandemic, that only got a million times worse, right? Because business owners were either shut down or they couldn't get the products that they needed to sell, or they were overwhelmed or they got sick. I know bodega owners that had COVID but couldn't shut down. And so they had to find other people to come in. And, it just every day, every little thing that might go wrong, it impacts one person and therefore the entire business. And most of them don't have employees.
Can I ask a question about language? Because that's something that, we've talked a little bit about. As a journalist, we tend to kind of go with the flow and try to figure out what's sort of acceptable. On campuses, obviously, Latinx has become very popular and you use it in your presentation. But when you see surveys out there, it turns out only 5% of Hispanics want to be called that. They want to be called Hispanics. Latino has been out there. And I'm sort of wondering what your thoughts are, not only about how to refer to groups, but the politics behind that and the messages that we send about inclusion or diversity, how you would have us navigate that.
So one of the many challenges associated with intergroup collaboration is different rules of the linguistic game. So if we're talking about Latinos in the US, we're talking overwhelmingly Spanish speakers. If we want to include Brazilians, fine, because it's part of the same language family, which is the Romance language family. Every word, correction, every noun I utter in Spanish is gendered, period. Adjectives are gendered. There's no gender neutral version of, it's the whole Romance language family. And there are many other languages that have the same attributes. So you have a challenge where there's a movement on the part of some folks in American English who want to remove gender where possible. And yet there's a term that comes from a language that has gender in it. Now, what I find interesting is that English is very liberal with regards to borrowing loan words from other languages. Whether people realize it or not, many of those words are gendered. I find it interesting that Latino is slated for gender reassignment, but all these other gendered words in English are not. Ultimately, they're terms that pop up and die. Some may survive. I'm not sure what the future is going to be. I use Latino, but that's just what I'm accustomed to. don't know if you-
One of the strategies I deploy is ask the people in the community what they want to be called, what their common usage is, and if it's Latino or Hispanic, but I think there's always an assumption that one category name or the other is what's going to be used rather than actually asking. So go ahead and ask and use the category that they prefer. And sometimes they don't like any of those and they want it to be specific to the region that they come from. They want it to be country specific. So Ecuadorian American, or they just want to be Ecuadorian, right? They don't want any sort of signifier of place attached to it. So it kind of depends. And so just ask, because they're not typically asked. Folks are not typically asked. So asking, I think, is the place to start. And I think that creates the kind of dialogue about identity and identity issues, I think is a good place to begin. New Rican.
So I identify as Latina, but I think as we were forming this group, that was a huge discussion because in Boston and across the nation, you have an older population that got one word in that 1940s through 1980s. It was Hispanic was the only way that you can identify without using your, country of origin, which I think also created a lot of division between countries of origin. Even in City Hall, when we were starting this conversation, there were Dominicans that had never talked to the Puerto Ricans that had been working in that building for 10, 15, 20 years. And so bringing all those people into one room and having this discussion about what are we going to call ourselves? We're this employee resource group. We're supposed to be inclusive. We're supposed to be thoughtful. And at the end of the day, the conversation ended up, what is the most inclusive term? And for us at the moment, back then was Latinx, because we had gender non-binary. We had folks who didn't want to be identified as Latino or Latina. And so we went with Latinx. And now there's a new kind of wave, which is Latine, which is the E at the end instead of the X. And what that in theory represents is the ability to use that word in Spanish, because if you're speaking in Spanish, you can't say Latinx. Like, you sound dumb, right? Because you don't, you're not, it doesn't translate. And so now using Latine, it's something that you can say in English, you can say it in Spanish, you could say it probably in Portuguese, and so on and so forth. But it's I think part of what we're trying to figure out is how individuals want to be identified, but also what is a commonality that allows us to also unite in a way of some of those shared experiences and being able to, politically, I think, really come together to change, make some real change. So again, ask people what they want to be called, but I think it's always going to be evolving.
We can turn it over to the students now. You can either come down here and speak there, or I will run up the stairs and come to you. So.
This was such a great panel. Thank you so much. I have one fact question, and forgive me if you answer this. I just may have missed it, but I was very struck by the gender disparity in wage earning or wage earners. Seemed like many more women were employed. I wondered if that was simply men not declaring that they were employed. What was behind that? But so much of your presentation is about money. And where this population is. And I know students have questions, and I took the liberty of the mic first because I don't know if they'd be bold enough to ask this question. And I find myself very curious, and of course, feel free to decline to answer, how your own personal stories, my colleagues, Professors Barreto and Nieves, and your family stories, their immigration stories, map on to the data that we've seen. Clearly, you don't map onto the data, but I just want to know what it was like for you to have been raised in this country to the extent that you were, how long your families have been here, if you were in integrated communities or not, how you experience the embodied identities that you have growing up here and, rising to the stature that you have.
Okay, we each have different experiences. In my case, I was born in Puerto Rico. When I was 4, moved to the US mainland, and it was my choice to go back to Puerto Rico for college, where I moved in with my grandmother. So she became my college roommate. Those were some of the happiest years of my life, and boy, did I gain a lot of weight. So it's one thing to speak Spanish at home with my parents, but all of a sudden to be thrust back in Puerto Rico where everything is in Spanish, including coursework, exams. And it's not street Spanish, it's Royal Academy Spanish, even with a Puerto Rican accent, but still it's the formal language. It's a very different beast entirely. So I have an identification with, broadly speaking, Latin America much stronger than my siblings, just because of different experiences. Here's a great anecdote. When I go to San Antonio to visit my parents, that's where they retired, I have no qualm speaking Spanish in public. Outside of San Antonio, neighboring counties, I would be careful. But in San Antonio, if we get stared at, it'll be because we're using, from their perspective, an odd Caribbean accent. We went to a restaurant, it was a Mexican restaurant, surprise, in San Antonio. I was speaking with the waiter, clearly Mexican-American. He was struggling to put together a sentence in Spanish. Clearly he was 5th, 6th, 7th generation. Okay. At the same time, I overheard the guys in the kitchen, and I'm wondering if they crossed the border last week. So within the same community, you're gonna have people who are unilingual Spanish speakers, unilingual English speakers, and every shade of bilingualism in between. And that's just gonna be our reality, because as people assimilate and become English dominant, then eventually monolingual Anglophone, you're still gonna have more people coming in from Latin America. It's gonna be a very odd community, linguistically speaking.
So we were the only Puerto Rican family in an all Jewish neighborhood. And my parents only went to, perfect. My parents only completed 6th grade, only had a 6th grade education. And the only books that ever came into our house were the books me or my sister brought into the house. So reading was not something my parents did, but we did a lot of, and we're always encouraged to do that. And my father had a lot of rules about speaking Spanish in public. And so I'll just quickly tell one story about speaking Spanish in public. When we were on the elevator, and if my mother and I were on the elevator and someone came on with us and we had been talking in Spanish, we were to stop speaking in Spanish. And I was to only speak in English. My mother was to completely stop because she had a heavy accent in English. There were other rules about speaking, because we were just not supposed to represent ourselves as, my mother's actually looks kind of Italian, maybe a little Jewish, but we were not supposed to signify as Latino in any kind of way. We were just supposed to stop, speaking Spanish. So that was kind of the upbringing. We were supposed to sort of deny that we could, signify that particular way. Yeah, it was a tough upbringing, but we were the only Latinos in this all Jewish co-op building. And it was a very strange upbringing. I mean, it was fun in some ways, but there was a lot of trauma there. Yeah.
So I would say my experience. So I'm from Colombia. I was born there, and my sisters and I moved to the States when I was 6, almost 7. But I was very lucky, very privileged, I should say, because my mom had gotten her doctorate degree. She was a lawyer in Colombia. But the late 80s and early 90s was a terrible time in Colombia. You may have seen it through some documentaries and some fun movies. But it was really traumatizing. And so we had the privilege. My dad, although is Colombian, he was born in the US. So we got to come to the US through citizenship, through naturalized citizenship. But because my mom was she studied linguistics, and she knew that in America we would learn English no matter where we were. She had the opposite rule, which was with us, only Spanish. Like, absolutely, don't even try it. I won't answer you. I won't listen to you unless you speak in Spanish at home. And I'm so deeply grateful to her for that, because obviously you can hear my English. My Spanish only comes out in certain moments, especially if I'm angry. But what you find is that I can actually speak Spanish not perfectly, because I also had the experience. I went back to Colombia before moving to Boston, and I was like, volunteering for the presidential campaign there, and I was having to write, and my written Spanish was so embarrassing. Because it's so formal, the way that people speak and write is incredibly formal. It's incredibly perfect, right? You are taught that the written word has to be perfect. So that was a big struggle for me when I went back to Colombia. But here I've been able to help with interpretation, translation, all that, because I was able to have that experience. But I will say that we moved from Colombia to Chicago to Arizona, where the population is majority Mexican. And that is because the border actually moved, not the Mexicans, most of them. What was it? What year was that? 1848. Thank you. I was going to say something really bad. 1848. So you still have generations of people in Mexico or in Arizona, New Mexico, California, who were Mexican. They were in Mexico. But when I was in Arizona, I oftentimes felt so out of place as a Colombian immigrant. People would be like, you're not Latina enough, or, white people would say, you're not white enough, or, and I never identified as either. I identified as Colombian. And so that experience for so long was kind of this like middle world that, like, if anybody gets a chance, there's actually a really great documentary called Enya, which is the N with the little squiggly on top. It's a very low budget, but really impactful documentary about that experience of Latinos in the US, where we don't really have that place all the time, especially because oftentimes we don't collaborate or unite in a way that actually allows us to have a conversation about this weird middle place of not being Latino enough, not being white enough, depending on how good your Spanish is, or how, do you even speak Spanish, and those identifiers, which I think is really interesting.
This is an issue that's come up in a few of my classes, and it's quite an anomaly. You may not realize that English is the only major language on this planet that is not formally regulated by one body. Every other major language on planet Earth is regulated. So for example, all Spanish-speaking countries adhere to the Real Academia Española, the Royal Spanish Academy. Go to Madrid, there's the Prado Museum, famous art museum. Right behind it is the building for the Real Academia. That is the institution that regulates the Spanish language for all Spanish-speaking countries. The equivalent in French is the Académie Française. So every other language. So it's interesting how in this country, one person can start a movement to change a language versus another language is, oh, you have a proposal, you must send it to the Language Academy, and they're going to argue, they're going to debate. And I know there was an issue when Spain joined the European Union about getting rid of the ñ. The N with the tilde over it is not, the tilde is not an accent, it's a separate letter of the alphabet. And the Royal Academy was like, nope. So.
Okay, this is like really hyper specific, and I'm sorry, but you were mentioning that like the Royal Academy of Spanish is in Spain. And I remember when I took Spanish lessons, we learned that like they used vosotros over there and not anywhere else. Does that mean like formal Spanish in Latin America uses vosotros, but not like spoken Spanish?
I need to be careful because I'm not assuming that everyone in this audience is familiar with the language. So in Spanish, the second person plural. In English, you is one person or 10 people. In other languages, you have a separate word. In Spain and in some parts of Latin America, they still use the word vosotros, you in the plural. Some countries use ustedes. It's not just used in Spain, but let's put it this way. When I was in Spain, I tried to use vosotros, which has a different conjugation. And I'm like, I can't do this. I'll use ustedes, you guys use vosotros, we'll just understand each other. That'll be, the Royal Academy, however, is comprised not exclusively of Spaniards, but playwrights, linguists, other notable writers from all over the Spanish-speaking world. But it's for the Spanish language, hence its rules would not apply to the Catalan language, which is the dominant language in Barcelona or the region of Catalonia, or northwest Spain, where they speak Gallego, which is actually dialect of Portuguese, or in the far north, where they speak Basque, which is not even an Indo-European language. So there are actually 4 distinct languages in Spain.
Thank you.
We had a very lively conversation among the students before the open session started that covered a number of questions and comments in the context of race and microaggressions and politics and Donald Trump and a range of other things. So perhaps some of the students who made comments or raised questions then could follow up with our panelists.
Wonderful. Cool. Thank you all so much for all your presentations. It was really interesting hearing the different perspectives you all brought. I would really like to know, 2016 was a very eventful year. And I guess sort of like from your perspectives, both like through your own identities and also through the different disciplines and sectors that you work in, how did you see people reacting to Trump's election? Both from just the like sheer shock of it, but also afterward, there was that sort of period where people were blaming Latinx voters, particularly Cubans, for the way that Florida voted or that Texas swung a certain way. So I'd really love to hear like any reactions that you experienced as a result of the election.
Well, personally, while I was horrified, I was not shocked. The reason being, most of my peers, professors, academics, intellectuals, they spend their entire lives in bubbles, progressive bubbles. Even if they go to Ithaca, New York, and you're out in the woods, it's still a progressive little bubble. While I was finishing my doctorate at SUNY Buffalo, I was teaching at Alfred State College in very rural Western New York, hugging the Pennsylvania border. We're talking Amish nearby. Not in town, but very close by. I had experience living in Trumplandia before there was a Trump. There was a people in search of a Messiah. I got it. The same thing happens when I visit my folks in Texas, leave San Antonio, leave Bejar County to some of the neighboring counties. I'm like, this is a different America. And most academics are not familiar with it because frankly, they just hop from progressive bubble to progressive bubble. They'll go to London, but will they go to a small town necessarily in rural Pennsylvania? Probably not. So yeah.
I mean, I can talk about this. So I was also not surprised, but because I think there's a lot more to just Trump getting elected. I think people didn't want to elect a woman. So I think there was a lot of misogyny there, even in just the rhetoric, regardless of how you feel about Hillary Clinton. My sister, she told me the next morning that she felt like she had been punched in the gut, mostly because she was very adamant about not supporting either candidate. And I think that was a big awakening for a lot of progressive, like ultra liberal, ultra left progressive folks, because at the end of the day, voting is a requirement, right? And she voted. She just did not vote for a presidential candidate, and she felt it the next day. And she said, "I will never do that again." I think a lot of the policies that we associate with Trump were not necessarily Trumpian policies. A lot of them existed in the early 90s and the 80s, and have continued on. And he was able to, through his rhetoric, use them. And so, I think Trump, I try to see the silver lining in it, and hopefully we've learned a lot from that experience. And I think what I can say is that I urge young people and people of color in particular to be registered to vote and actively participate in their local, state, and federal elections. A lot of people only show up for those presidential elections because they're big, because they're everywhere. But really, a lot of the politics and a lot of the stuff that is happening, the good things that are happening at a more localized level. And I was deeply proud to work for Mayor Walsh during that time. That, you know, I remember that night, there were so many tears. It was like a funeral at City Hall for weeks after Trump was elected. But the leadership internally and the support for immigrant populations, for immigrant rights, for women, that, again, Mayor Walsh spearheaded during those first couple months, I think really set the tone in Boston of what was tolerated and what would not be tolerated. And I think because of that, I felt hopeful, at least at the local level, which is also a progressive bubble. And, you know, I think part of what needs to continue to happen is those local conversations, so that when you have these big elections that really, you know, they impact all of us, but every single election impacts everyone. So I was not surprised. I was very frustrated, but I think it allowed other good things to happen.
I'll say I wasn't surprised either, but what surprised me, or at least it confirmed for me, that America largely does not like intellectuals or intellectualism. And I think that's something that they saw in Hillary, that on top of the misogyny and Bill Clinton and all the rest that came with her, that was a part of it. That really, it really saddened me that we can't elect smart people to office. That was something that really prevented her from being elected. But the one thing that it did also say to me was, we have got to build coalitions across the aisle because we saw what happened in 2020, right? And we just cannot be apathetic and just, you know, not vote, not build those relations with one another, and pick a cause and fight for it. Because you as students do not understand, I think, always the power that you have when you unite to do things. You can make massive change happen. So if you build coalitions, you can make things change. So you've got to get together and figure out how to do that. And you can do it. The sheer numbers, that's what, you know, and what I tried to say in my comments, universities do not want you to build coalitions because there are way too many of you. But if you build coalitions, you can make things really happen. And as alumni, you particularly can make things happen. And as future alumni, you can make things happen now. So, you know, just think about that as you think about the kind of causes you want to get behind.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I was wondering your thoughts on coalition building, especially with Haitian immigrants in this moment.
I'm still relatively new to Boston, but I will say that our new director of Africana Studies, Regine Jean Charles, is an active member of the Haitian American community. And this is one of the target communities that I know our colleagues, our community in terms of culture, society, and global studies is particularly interested in trying to reach and do more things with. So that's my pitch, but I think my colleague can say more.
One of the challenges with coalition building anywhere is not just where you're from, where are you? And I say this because when I think of Haitian Americans, think of the largest pockets would be like here, New York City, and in Florida. So one of the challenges is in each setting, coalition building means working with a different set of actors. Nothing wrong with that, but I think most immigrant communities here, regardless, will be working with a constellation probably of progressive groups and different ethnic groups. It's just adjusting that to a different setting. Not unlike the fact that, yes, in this area, we have a significant number of Brazilians. It's one of the only regions in the United States where you have a significant number of Brazilians. And to add complexity, the Portuguese-speaking community here is comprised of people from the Azores, from Europe, from Brazil, and from Cabo Verde in Africa. So all Lusophone, but three very distinct historic cultural backgrounds.
One of the subjects that Professor Kaufman and I talked about at the outset was the history of Black Jewish coalitions, which were fundamental during the Civil Rights era. And we'll have further discussion of that at later classes. And we also spoke with Professor Lefkowitz about that. And those coalitions, for a variety of reasons, don't exist to the same extent that they used to. I think one of the most interesting comments that Natalia has made is that even within City Hall, there are Latinx people who've worked in the same building for years, a decade, and yet Dominicans may not speak with Puerto Ricans, and Cubans may not speak with Mexicans. And it's clear that in the absence of coalitions, it is extremely difficult, particularly in a city the size of Boston, which is very small, but across the country, it's extremely difficult to carry forward with any kind of agenda, with any hope that in fact the agenda can be achieved. So part of the question is, how does one go about building those coalitions? Is it just a matter of having intercultural suppers? Do people have to work together on similar kinds of tasks? How does one go about finding the common ground around which coalitions are built? And that's the part of why we're having this class.
So just very quickly, I think, I got a lot of hate when I wanted to start this Latinx ERG. It came from people saying, oh, all the young people want to just change everything, right? Traditionally like more Americanized Latinx members versus immigrant, and in a gap in shared experiences, because that's what really brings a coalition together is, we all want to talk about that thing that happened to us. And one of the things that we did really early on was I said, I don't care where you're from. If you identify as Latin or not, you are welcome in this group. And we had, and still do have Haitian members, like I said, Brazilian members. We have, we've opened it up to even Spaniards. There was a lot of dialogue about whether or not Spaniards would be part of the Latinx ERG, because traditionally Spaniards are Spanish. They're not Latinx, right? And part of that was my stubbornness and my refusal to allow that to happen. I was really saddened, though, that when the conflict and the assassination happened in Haiti, I got some messages on social media because I'm Colombian and the shooters were Colombian. And I took a step back and I said, this is not what we're about. Like the Latinx ERG showed up to the rally for Haiti, and we were very clear about that tolerance and zero tolerance around those types of conversations, because I have nothing to do with the assassination that happened in Haiti. Why that would even happen is exactly that mentality that prevents us from coalition and union building, right? And making sure that we're supporting our brothers and sisters all over the world and specifically in Latin America.
I also wanted to underline the connection between coalition building and activism. You have to decide what you're coalition building for. But on the just the Haitian question, there is a small effort to resettle Haitians in the Boston area. I think 100 families are coming in, and there's some activism around getting these families what they need. They need bedding, they need beds. There are lists of things that people need, and I think that on a very practical level, one of the reasons we need to get together is so that we can offer support to particularly religious organizations that are doing some of the grassroots work on, easing suffering in the world.
And Boston has been traditionally a city that has always extended both like resources and, as were just mentioned, across Puerto Rico, Texas, like you name it, anyone who was needing it, Boston does a lot of work there.
Hi, thank you so much all for the discussion. It's been really interesting. So earlier in our class, we were discussing reparations due to the US history of colonialism in Latin America and continued impact on Latin American countries. And I was just curious to hear your thoughts on reparations in the US and then Boston specifically as well, and like the feasibility of those politically and what they could look like.
Can I take my city hat off? Is that allowed? Can you guys allow me to take my city hat off and be just a public, regular person? So I will say I believe in a form of reparations. I think when we think about policy and we think about funding, as a person that works in that space, it's really hard to do that, and it's not going to happen overnight. But things like universal minimum income and subsidizing and or getting rid of costs associated with those things that people of color who tend to be Black and brown are faced with on a regular day-to-day, I think is a way of building not just wealth, but stability in our communities, because the war on poverty has been going on forever, and it's really the policies that keep that poverty going. So I believe childcare, healthcare, mental health services, and housing stability, those things can really deeply impact our communities to build wealth, which I think is more important than one payout, and creating systems for that to be the norm and no questions asked, I think is the dignity that humans deserve. And you see that across most of our Black and brown communities. So that's what I would say.
I think one thing that came up was the idea of using reparations in the form of immigration policy. In other words, is that something that either would be appropriate and would it be politically feasible to kind of use that in terms of how it would affect the Latino community, especially people trying to settle here?
Yeah, I mean, one way to answer it is maybe by understanding the US's involvement in supporting the drug trafficking trade in Latin America that supported all of the narco traffickers, and then understanding its impact in particular on families that had to flee particular countries. And so I'm sort of putting on my historian hat and saying, I think the way to reparations is actually to understand the history of the damage done to these particular communities. And until we sort of understand that particular damage, we can't really come to a true place for reparations. We can't understand the depth of what the reparations might even begin to look like, right? And CRJ here, the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern, is doing a lot of that work for the Jim Crow era. So I want to encourage everyone to look that project up as one of the ways that's trying to get at some of that history to then figure out what reparations may begin to look like. But we can't really understand, why immigration is such a hot button issue and how we can even begin to dismantle the policies that we put in place until we understand how we were culpable in creating the problem ourselves in the first place.
I find just very quick, 2 quick points. One is that the issue of reparations for historic injustices, especially colonialism. Speaking as a Puerto Rican, I find that rather humorous because we're still a colony 123 years later, and it's not changing that status, unfortunately, anytime soon. When it comes to immigration, I'm amused by some conversations I had with my folks this summer. Now that I got vaccinated, I could finally go and visit them. They started pointing to all their neighbors who supported the prior administration and were keen on sealing that border and had absolutely no problem hiring a host of illegal immigrants to do lawn work, to do this, to do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The fact is, the American economy from day one has been addicted to immigrant labor. And so the challenge is, how do you keep the economy going at the same time? How do you deal with the anxieties of all of a sudden, oh my goodness, the population demographics are changing? And it's amusing when, not that I'm a historian, but every now and then I do read certain works of history. It's amazing going back to the scholars who've worked on the immigration debates from a century ago. The rhetoric is virtually identical. It's just a different group of immigrants, but the same kind of racialization of immigrants. Yes, and I'm talking about immigrants from Europe. The same nastiness, vile rhetoric, it's almost the same. Sorry.
Just want to ask a question about the immigration policy and tolerance to immigrants as well. So a few months ago, I happened to talk to a friend who happened to be a white nativist. And he's a little against immigration policy because he claims that, his white family came to the States hundreds of years ago. And he said, what if, something happens in the future, like a war or climate change or something, that the United States will be in a disaster, but he and his family will have nowhere to go, but pretty much to die with this country. But a lot of other immigrants like Latinx people and Asians will still have a backup place to leave. So his claim is that, he said, we're asking Americans to welcome people from all over the world to share this land, this living space with them. But imagine in the future, something happened to the States. Do you think other countries like the Global South, Latin countries will welcome Americans with the equal kind of welcoming?
Forgive me, but this friend of yours, it sounds like he's using some really lame excuses to justify xenophobia. That's just, this is BS on steroids. I'm just calling what it is. In the same way that people don't always talking about the fact that there are Americans who do immigrate to other countries. So some go to Europe, some go to Asia, some go elsewhere. But immigration is not necessarily a one-way street. And it was after the 2016 election that I heard that the websites for the immigration office for the Canadian government virtually collapsed because of all these Americans looking in 2016 to perhaps immigrate to Canada. So there are options.
I mean, encourage your friend to do a genealogical, search for ancestry, because I think maybe they'd have a different opinion, and when they realize that they actually probably can't claim much ancestry that would keep them here to begin with. Or what might be even more troubling is that they'll find some indigenous, ancestry in their background. But just the whole premise is kind of problematic because unless you're indigenous, everyone's an immigrant.
But do you feel like the Native Americans have the right to say, step out of my land?
100%.
100%?
Yeah, so I think this is a deeply problematic. So I want to start by saying that I actually commend you for being friends with people who maybe don't think like you or think that it's really important to have these conversations. And I hope that you continue to have this dialogue with this person because I think part of learning and breaking down some of these frankly, arrogant perspectives, I think have to come through dialogue and really actual deep education around the history of this land and the people here. I think I would say that yes, Indigenous people, if they had the populations that they had back then and wanted to kick people out, with the exception of Black folks who were, I should say, African slaves who were brought here against their will. Yeah, they should. I think there's a deep disconnect around the history because you might have come here from 5 generations ago versus someone who's coming here 1 generation or is a new immigrant here. There are lots of reasons why people immigrate, and a lot of those reasons of like, if something were to happen in the future, it doesn't mean that that person is going to be able to go back to that country because that country was likely war-torn or impacted heavily by some of the policies from this country because there isn't somewhere in the world where this country hasn't had deep impact. So I think these conversations are really important to have. And I think you asking this question means that you are bringing that information back to them to have a more robust conversation. And I think you have some classmates here who would love to probably engage in that conversation in a non-threatening and educational way so that there is learning that's happening because a lot of this dialogue happens on the internet in the comment section and it is not productive. So I think it's really important to continue those conversations.
Thanks, because this class is called Repairing a Divided America. But am I allowed to ask her?
Actually, unfortunately, we're at 8 o'clock, so we need to,
Thanks a lot.
to wrap up, sure. Ted, do you want to?
Next week.
Okay, so next week, we're going to be looking at Asian Americans. And then with the support of the Ruderman Foundation, we're also going to be bringing in the first Asian American rabbi. And so I think our discussion will touch on politics and on history, but also we'll bring in religion, which I think is something that was briefly mentioned, but the role of religion and religious groups in bringing the country together historically and now, I think is something that will be worth exploring. So we'll see you back then. And I want to thank all of you for really a terrific conversation.